Imagine waking up one day and feeling like the life you've built is pressing in on all sides. The mask you've worn for decades starts to suffocate. The conversations you used to float through now sting with falseness. The roles, the routines, the smiles, all hollow. You're not broken, you're not depressed, you're waking up, and your body knows it first. This video explores the 7 things spiritually awake people slowly quit. Not through willpower or rebellion, but through a quiet, almost involuntary refusal. Jung observed this shedding not as a dramatic enlightenment, but as a process of release. Layers of who you're not falling away. One suffocating habit at a time. And if lately you've felt increasingly incompatible with normal life, unable to perform the old patterns, even when you try, this may explain why. These aren't conscious choices, at least not at first. They begin in your nervous system, in your gut, in the tremble of your hands when something no longer fits. And though it can feel like losing yourself, what's actually happening is a return, a remembering, a coming home to what was always real. As Jung noticed again and again, the self, your true, undistorted essence, doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives with clarity. And when it does, the old survival patterns you once called personality begin to feel unbearable. You don't quit them on principle. You quit them because your body starts saying no, loudly, viscerally, without asking permission from your mind. It starts in small ways. You're in a meeting, nodding along, preparing to say the polite thing, the smart thing, the thing they expect of you. But the words catch in your throat. You swallow once, twice. Nothing comes. Your face flushes. Sweat beads along your back. Your hands twitch under the table. You feel nauseous. Not from nerves, but from something deeper. Something sacred refusing to participate. Jung observed this again and again. The deeper your spiritual maturation, the more approval begins to taste like poison. What once felt like survival, pleasing, impressing, conforming, now makes your whole body rebel. You've lived for validation so long, you didn't notice it tightening around your ribs. But now, the mask no longer fits. And the strange part? You don't decide to quit seeking approval. You wake up and realize you already have. Or rather, you can't do it anymore. The mechanism is still there. You're tempted to reach for the same praise, the same parental nod. But your system rejects it like a sugar intolerance suddenly developed overnight. What used to nourish now makes you sick. One woman, Jung noted, had built her whole identity around pleasing her mother. For years, every decision, haircut, relationship, career, ran through her mother's lens. But as she awakened, the body began interfering. She'd pick up the phone to call her mom for reassurance, and her hands would shake. She'd feel queasy just trying to form the words. Another man, once laser-focused on professional recognition, found himself staring at the promotion he'd been chasing and feeling nothing, not defiance, not burnout, just an inner blankness where desire used to be. Something fundamental had shifted. Jung called it the self, an inner authority beyond the ego. Like a tree tapping into groundwater, it no longer needs rain. You begin to sense your own value, not as something earned, but something remembered. And it makes approval-seeking feel almost absurd, exhausting, foreign. You might still catch yourself posting, fishing, people-pleasing, but the aftertaste burns now. One woman described it like this. I used to rearrange my personality depending on who I was with. Now, when I try, my soul hits the emergency brake. You're not rejecting people. You're rejecting performance. It's okay if your body can't lie for love anymore. But if you've been craving uniqueness to replace approval, the next thing that falls away might surprise you. You've glimpsed something real through meditation, a heartbreak, a moment of stillness in nature. And suddenly, it feels like no one else quite understands. You start speaking differently, dressing differently, reading Rumi, quoting Ram Dass. You sense you're waking up while others are still asleep. And part of you, maybe a big part, wants them to know. Jung observed this stage as a common, even necessary stop along the spiritual path. He called it spiritual inflation. The ego grabs hold of genuine awakening and uses it to feel superior. You don't mean to posture, but you start dropping hints. Your mindfulness, your synchronicities, your consciousness level. You're not bragging, but you're definitely broadcasting, hoping someone notices your depth. But then, something cracks. One man, deep in his spiritual journey, had built an entire persona around being the wise one. Friends came to him for insight. He meditated longer, knew more, said less. He thought he was walking the path, until, in the middle of explaining some spiritual concept, he stopped mid-sentence. Later, he told Jung, "I suddenly saw myself from outside, and I looked ridiculous." He wasn't sharing wisdom, he was performing it. This moment begins the slow, sacred quit. You catch yourself about to share a vision and pause. Not because it's untrue, but because the impulse to be seen for it feels false, heavy, exhausting. You stop needing to be known as deep. You lose interest in appearing extraordinary. You become willing, finally, blessedly, to be ordinary. And here's the paradox Jung observed. The moment you quit performing specialness, your true uniqueness finally emerges. Not the curated version, not the spiritual mask, but the unedited, blooming you. You become individuated, not inflated, like a flower that opens for no one but the sun. The blooming is for the blooming, not for the watching. Being nobody is freedom, that man later said. Not a loss, but a release. You stop needing to shine above. You become willing to shine among, to be one thread in the great fabric, not a tassel on the edge. You don't need to prove your depth for it to be real. And when you stop pretending to be above suffering, something even more radical happens. You felt it. That pressure to smile, to stay positive, to be the one who radiates light. Especially if people see you as spiritual. You've learned the language. You know the affirmations. You've read the books. So when pain arrives, you know how to dress it up. It's all happening for a reason, you say. It's all love. But something inside aches. Jung noticed that genuine spiritual development doesn't make people happier. It makes them more real. And reality is a full spectrum experience. Grief, rage, boredom, longing, emptiness. The self doesn't bypass shadow. It integrates it. And the moment you stop performing happiness, something deeper begins to breathe. One woman, a respected therapist and longtime spiritual guide, had built her practice around being the enlightened one. Always calm, always wise, always loving. Then her son died, and everything broke. She tried to return to work. She tried to sit with clients, but the performance wouldn't come. She'd be mid-session, offering advice, and tears would start falling. Not tidy tears, but sobs. She said to Jung, "I thought being spiritual meant transcending human pain. Now I realize it means embracing it. I can't be the enlightened one anymore. I can only be the real one." You stop forcing smiles when your heart is breaking. You stop pretending to be above fear. You stop polishing your pain for spiritual display. And in doing so, you step into something sacred, spiritual embodiment, the willingness to be fully here as you are. No filter. It doesn't mean you lose your joy. It means your joy becomes rooted. It's not a performance. It's presence. It includes the tears, the trembling, the doubt. You become safe to feel again. You're allowed to be real, even if it's messy. Especially if it's messy. And when you stop needing everything to make sense, a strange kind of wisdom emerges from the unknown. It creeps in during the quiet moments. The ideas you once clung to, about who you are, what life means, how it's all supposed to unfold, begin to dissolve. Not violently, but like ink bleeding into water. You reach for familiar conclusions, and they slip through your fingers. The spiritual truths you once repeated like mantras now feel too sharp, too small. You don't know what's happening. You just know you can't pretend you're sure. Jung observed that spiritual awakening doesn't lead to more answers. It leads to a new relationship with not knowing. It's not confusion. It's clarity beyond concepts. You stop gripping for certainty not because everything is false, but because truth has become too alive to hold still. It's not a thing to possess. It's something that moves, and you must move with it. One man, a brilliant physicist, came to Jung in the middle of a breakdown. He'd had a profound awakening, and afterward, nothing made sense. Not his research, not his worldview, not even the coffee cup in his hand. "I used to know how the universe worked," he said. "Now I realize I don't even know how this works." Every time he tried to rebuild certainty, scientific or spiritual, it dissolved. Until one day, he stopped trying. Jung called this the cloud of unknowing, a state where not knowing becomes more truthful than any idea ever was. And slowly, the man quit his hunger for answers. First, he let go of how things work. Then, why things happen. Finally, who he thought he was. What emerged in place of certainty wasn't chaos, it was paradox. He began to act without needing guarantees, speak without needing to be right, commit while still allowing for mystery. This is the terrifying freedom of spiritual maturity. The ability to move without a map, to rest in questions without needing to shrink them into beliefs. Not because nothing is true, but because reality is bigger than your explanations. You don't have to know to belong here. But if you've stopped blaming the universe for your confusion, the next release may strike closer to home. At first, it feels impossible. How can you stop blaming when the pain was real? The betrayal, the abuse, the abandonment, they happened. And you've carried the weight of those wounds for so long, blaming became a kind of identity. It made you innocent. It made you righteous. It made you belong. But then something starts to shift. Not all at once, but like seams loosening around an old story. Jung observed that as people awaken spiritually, they undergo a radical shift in how they relate to their suffering. Blame no longer fits, not because they pretend nothing happened, but because they begin to see themselves not as victims of life, but as participants in it. The narrative expands, accountability deepens, power returns. One woman came to Jung filled with legitimate grief. A violent childhood, betrayal from a partner, repeated discrimination at work. Her anger was justified, her pain raw, but she was stuck, identified completely with being wronged. Through years of deep work, she began to trace the patterns, how she unconsciously chose partners who would betray her, workplaces that would mirror old wounds. "The day I stopped blaming," she said, "was the day I became free. Not because they weren't wrong, they were, but because I stopped using their wrongness to avoid my own responsibility for my life." It was never about excusing harm. It was about reclaiming authorship. Jung noticed a pattern in how this shift unfolds. First, rage at the unfairness. This shouldn't have happened. Then, recognition of repetition. Why does this keep happening? Next, seeing unconscious participation. How am I part of this? Then, radical responsibility. I am the author now. Finally, transcendence. We are all playing roles in each other's awakening. Another man had spent decades demonizing his father. Everything wrong with his life pointed back to that man's failings. But as his awareness deepened, something cracked open. I saw him clearly for the first time, he said. Just another wounded human doing his best with his own pain. And I saw myself, not a victim, but a soul who chose this exact father for my own evolution. This isn't spiritual bypassing. It's spiritual power, the ability to hold truth and pain in the same hand and choose freedom anyway. You're allowed to stop waiting for an apology to begin healing. And when you stop bypassing pain with light, your life becomes startlingly real. At first, enlightenment felt like an escape hatch. You touched peace, silence, stillness. You glimpsed the void and wanted to live there. Meditation became your medicine. Everything happens for a reason became your armor. We're all one became your boundary. But after a while, it stopped working. The stillness turned numb. The void turned cold. And underneath the glow, something felt missing. Jung saw this everywhere. The bypass, using spiritual ideas to avoid being human, using practices to anesthetize instead of integrate. And he noticed that real growth demanded a return, not up into transcendence, but down into embodiment, into need, into grief, into desire, into life. One longtime Buddhist practitioner had spent 20 years meditating his way out of pain. He'd achieved states of emptiness most could only dream of. He could sit in silence for days. He had touched no self. But his relationships were hollow. His body felt foreign. His emotions were distant memories. He came to Jung, cracked open. I thought spirituality was about transcending human experience, he said. Now I realize it's about finally having one. I spent 20 years trying to be nobody. Now I'm learning to be somebody. This somebody. With these wounds, these hungers, this life. This is the great return. The fall from heaven into your body. You stop using truth as escape. You stop using light to blind yourself to shadow. You begin to want, to rage, to feel again. And it doesn't mean you've fallen off the path. It means, finally, you're walking it. You can accept what is, and still have preferences. You can see everyone as the self, and still need boundaries. You can trust the universe, and still feel afraid. This is not contradiction. This is maturity. The sacred and. You're allowed to come back to your body without giving up your soul. And when you finally return to Earth, something unexpected begins to bloom. Connection. There's a stage in awakening when you pull away from almost everything. Conversations feel surface level. Friendships fade without drama. Even family gatherings begin to feel like you're watching someone else's life. You tell yourself it's necessary, sacred even. You're evolving. You're growing too conscious to connect. But somewhere inside, a quieter truth stirs. You're lonely. Jung observed that this phase, pulling away, feeling apart, floating above, often isn't awareness, but fear disguised as awakening. Not that solitude isn't necessary, it is. But isolation is different. It says, no one gets me. It says, I'm too awake to belong. But what if that's not awakening? What if that's armor? One woman had spent years in spiritual solitude. She journaled, she prayed, she fasted. She believed she was alone because she was too conscious for others. But as her awareness deepened, she saw the truth. "I wasn't isolated because I was enlightened," she said. "I was isolated because I was afraid. Afraid of being seen in my mess. Afraid of not living up to the image of the awakened one." Her spiritual isolation, she realized, was actually spiritual pride. And when she let that go, connection returned. Not through merging, not through small talk, but through conscious relationship. She could sit with people still asleep because she remembered her own sleep. She could speak with compassion, not condescension. She could love without needing to teach. She could belong without disappearing. This is what Jung called conscious community, where souls who are quitting the same patterns meet, not to prove, but to practice. To walk together, awake and unfinished. You're allowed to connect without pretending to be complete. If you've been slowly quitting something, approval, certainty, performance, blame, share it in the comments below. Not to announce your progress, but to name your experience. Someone else might read your words and finally recognize themselves. That's how we remember we're not alone in this. We're not scattered souls wandering solo. We're a quiet, steady circle. Each of us shedding old skins, returning to what's real, learning to speak without pretense and love without masks. Let your story ripple through this space. Let your quitting become someone else's invitation. This is not a confession. This is a rite of passage. Each time you quit one of these 7 things, something more true begins to emerge. When you quit seeking approval, a quiet sense of inner worth rises. Not confidence that needs applause, but value that breathes from within. When you quit trying to be special, your true uniqueness flowers, naturally without effort. When you quit performing happiness, genuine joy can finally land. When you quit needing certainty, wisdom flows. When you quit blaming, power returns to your hands. When you quit bypassing, you become whole, spirit and skin, insight and impulse. When you quit isolation, real connection roots. Jung observed that this path isn't linear, it spirals. You'll quit and return, let go and reach back. You'll catch yourself mid-performance, mid-pleasing, mid-blame. And instead of judging, you'll breathe. Each time the pattern loosens a little more. That's not failure. That's the work. You're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. Not the version molded by expectations, but the self that's been waiting underneath. The one that doesn't need applause or answers or masks. Just space. Just truth. Just time. Let this be your reminder. What's falling away was never truly you. What remains is, and that is enough. If this feels like your path, stay with us. Subscribe and tap the bell. Not as a strategy, but as a way of staying in the circle. This is a space for souls in the slow, sacred process of waking up. We're not here to be perfect. We're here to be real. Come walk with us. The journey is lighter together.